Houston, this is Neil, radio check.
Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear. Break. Buzz, this is Houston, radio check and verified TV circuit breaker in.
Yeah, I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
One of humanity's most famous quotes. The first man to land on the moon is recognized throughout the world as a groundbreaking discovery and accomplishment. Who would have known that a heated space race between two of the most powerful nations in the world would lead to some of the most iconic and discovery-breaking moments? Within the span of a decade, the United States and the Soviet Union did the unthinkable and expanded our known frontiers from within our planet to out of this world. The arms race, the rising nuclear danger, extensive espionage and counter-espionage between the two nations, and the media struggle all contributed to the US-Soviet Cold War being a part of daily life in both nations by the mid-1950s. The United States and Soviet Union governments were working towards creating satellites in response to a goal set by the International Council of Scientific Unions in 1957 and 1958. The United States tried many rocket and missile models over a long period, but none of these tests were successful. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the planet's first artificial satellite, roughly 2 years after the American announcement of wanting to launch a satellite themselves. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States during this period, was alarmed when the Soviets launched Sputnik 1. The technical advancement of the Soviet Union took the American government, military, and scientific community by surprise, and their coordinated attempts to catch up to the Soviets signaled the start of the space race. Shortly after Sputnik 1's launch, the Soviets would launch Sputnik 2 into space, but this time would carry a dog named Laika, making the Soviet Union the first nation to successfully launch a living organism into space. On the following year, the first American satellite, Explorer, would be sent into orbit. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and other government agencies worked with the United States Congress to pass legislation in July of that year that established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and reaffirmed the nation's commitment to winning the space race. The two nations would go back and forth to see who would be the quote-unquote first nation for certain landmarks in space. For instance, the first communication satellite launched by the US, the USSR launching the first spacecraft to orbit the moon and take pictures of its far side, and much more. These advancements have been used in a variety of different applications. Hundreds of man-made satellites now orbit the Earth, providing us with worldwide communication networks, television, global positioning systems, and meteorological data. Space exploration has also improved our theoretical and practical understanding of astronomy, meteorology, physics, and other terrestrial sciences, just a few of the frontiers set at only halfway through the space race. A major turning point for this race gave the Soviet Union a push to first place. The first human spaceflight is made by Soviet astronaut Yuri Gagarin on board the spacecraft Vostok 1. As a result of the Soviet space program's success in sending the first man into space, the United States suffered a huge loss as they had planned to send one of their own men into space at a later date. In February 1962, astronaut John Glenn completed 3 orbits in Friendship 7, a feat that the American space program had not accomplished since Gagarin orbited the Earth. During the space race, the Soviet Union had already made substantial progress with the Vostok 2 mission, in which cosmonaut Gernot Titov orbited the moon 17 times and spent more than 25 hours in space. The United States suffered a setback in 1967 when 3 astronauts were killed during a launch rehearsal when a fire ignited in their Apollo 1 capsule on the launch pad. While this was going on, the Soviet Union's lunar landing program moved slowly, in part because of internal disagreement over its need and the program's main engineer, Sergei Korolyov's unexpected passing. Following these tragic events, the United States knew it was time for them to move forward. The first manned space mission to orbit the moon, Apollo 8, was launched in 1968 from NASA's enormous launch complex on Merritt Island. NASA's Apollo 11 mission, a first attempt at landing on the moon, was launched in 1969 by Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Armstrong famously referred to this event as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, when he successfully landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969.
Columbus explored one new world. You're about to explore another. How do you feel about such comparisons?
Well, I'm very impressed to be compared with Columbus, and of course we recognize his discovery and have honored it in some respects by the call sign of our command module, Columbia. It was a voyage with a good bit of risk and some complaints. However, in many ways it was not at all like the voyage of Apollo 11.
Armstrong would then explain how the frontier expanding nation compared to the frontier expanding world. Towards the end of the interview, Armstrong gave a specific example of how this interstellar discovery was able to happen in the first place.
And it's also necessary to notice that he did it without an entire nation's efforts behind him. Our voyage is the voyage of a nation and a voyage of humanity, while his was a voyage of a very limited few.
Fast forward a few years, in 1975, with tensions between the US and the USSR softening, the first cooperative Apollo-Soyuz mission is launched with two separate flights. The Apollo and Soyuz spacecraft dock in space and have the two commanders, Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov. When the commanders of the two crafts officially greeted each other, their quote-unquote handshake in space served to symbolize the gradual improvement of the US-Soviet relations, signifying the end of the space race and corporations in the late Cold War era. The space race was always an outgrowth of the ideological conflict between these two countries. The space race was regarded as significant because it demonstrated to the world which country has the finest science, technology, and economic structure. Space became the ultimate frontier for the United States and the Soviet Union to battle for supremacy.